In the ancient world, executions were more than just a way to remove the guilty. They were theater, rituals of dominance, and most disturbingly, a way to strip a person of dignity before taking their life. For women, whose honor and modesty were bound tightly to cultural expectations, humiliation was often the central element of punishment. Death itself could be swift, but shame was enduring. In both ancient Greece and Rome, female executions were staged not only to eliminate those who broke the rules, but to send a message to all women: disobedience, impurity, or defiance would not be tolerated. To understand these brutal practices, one must first recognize how deeply intertwined the concepts of honor, purity, and obedience were with a woman's value. In Greece, a woman's chastity defined her family's reputation. In Rome, the virtue of women, especially those tied to sacred roles, was seen as a reflection of the stability of the entire state. When a woman failed to live up to these expectations or was accused of failing, the punishments were designed to annihilate not only her life but her identity, her dignity, and her honor. One of the most harrowing examples of this can be seen in the fate of the Vestal Virgins of Rome. Chosen as young girls to serve the goddess Vesta, they were sworn to 30 years of chastity. Their purity was considered essential to Rome's well-being. The flame of Vesta they guarded symbolized the eternal survival of the empire. But if a Vestal Virgin broke her vow, or even if she was accused, the punishment was unlike any other. To kill a Vestal outright was considered sacrilege. So instead, Rome devised a chillingly humiliating ritual. The condemned Vestal was led through the streets in silence, dressed not as a criminal, but as a bride, her attire mocking the purity she was accused of betraying. Crowds would watch in silence, as if attending a grotesque ceremony. She was then taken to a chamber underground, given a small lamp, food, and water not to sustain her, but to mask the act of execution. The entrance was sealed, and she was left to suffocate slowly in darkness. The message was unmistakable. Her body, once sacred, was now unworthy of light or air. Her death was not just punishment, but erasure. Her very existence buried beneath the earth, as if Rome itself rejected her. In Greece, public humiliation was more direct. Women accused of adultery, betrayal, or even sacrilege could face punishment staged for maximum spectacle. One such method was stoning, a communal act of execution where the entire community participated. Unlike the swift slice of a blade, stoning was prolonged, brutal, and degrading. The victim was forced to endure not just physical agony but the collective judgment of society. To be stoned was to be erased by the very people who once formed one's community, a punishment that destroyed not only the body but any sense of belonging or dignity. But executions could go further still, blending humiliation with sadistic spectacle. In Rome, women condemned for serious crimes or treason could be thrown into the arena, naked and defenseless, before wild beasts. This was not only a death sentence, but a performance designed to strip away every shred of humanity before the fatal moment. The roaring crowds, the exposure of the body, and the violent dismemberment by animals turned execution into a grotesque form of entertainment. The woman's suffering was consumed as spectacle, her death less an act of justice and more a feast of humiliation for the masses. The Romans even devised symbolic punishments that mocked the identities of women. Some sources describe parading condemned women through the streets before their deaths, forcing them into degrading costumes or stripping them of clothing to emphasize their vulnerability. To a culture where modesty was seen as sacred, public nudity was not simply exposure, it was the destruction of honor, the reduction of a woman to nothing more than an object of ridicule. Before the final blow of execution, in Greece, humiliation was also a punishment in itself, sometimes even more terrifying than death. Women accused of crimes such as betrayal could be paraded through the streets before execution, subjected to verbal abuse, spitting, and physical assault. This was a ritual meant to brand them as examples, to reduce them to living symbols of disgrace. Their bodies became warnings, their deaths almost secondary to the shame inflicted in the hours or days before. The pattern is clear. For women, punishment was rarely just about removing the individual. It was about controlling all women, reinforcing the idea that their worth lay in purity, modesty, and obedience. To defy these expectations was to risk not just death, but a death drenched in shame. Even within Rome's supposedly sophisticated legal system, women were subjected to cruel humiliations before execution. Noble women accused of conspiring against emperors or engaging in treasonous acts were often stripped of their titles, their jewelry, their dignity, and paraded as common criminals before being executed. The act of degradation was as important as the act of killing. By humiliating the woman, Rome symbolically destroyed the honor of her family, her lineage, and everything she represented. And yet, in many cases, the humiliations were exaggerated for effect. Ancient writers often delighted in recording these tales of disgrace. Using them as moral lessons, women's deaths became stories, warnings, or even lurid entertainment in the texts that survived. This makes it difficult for modern historians to separate fact from propaganda. But what remains consistent is the theme. Women were executed not only to end their lives, but to annihilate their dignity, turning punishment into spectacle. The blending of humiliation and execution reveals the darkest side of ancient justice. It was not enough for women to die, they had to die dishonored, exposed, and shamed before their community. In Greece, stoning in public parades turned death into collective rejection. In Rome, the Vestal Virgins' burials and the bloody arenas of the Colosseum transformed execution into ritual humiliation. These punishments remind us that in the ancient world, justice was as much about control as it was about law, and women's suffering was often staged as a lesson for all. The cruelty of these punishments did not only rest in their brutality, but also in how they targeted a woman's very identity. While men in Greece and Rome might die on the battlefield with honor, women condemned by the state were forced to die in disgrace. Their deaths were crafted to be examples, to remind society of the boundaries placed upon women and the devastating consequences of crossing them. One of the starkest examples in Rome comes from the treatment of women accused of adultery. During the imperial period, though the penalty was not always execution, the methods of punishment themselves were steeped in humiliation. Women of noble families could be dragged from their homes, stripped of wealth and protection, and forced into exile. In harsher cases, they were executed, but not before being degraded in public. The process was intentionally shaming. Their names were announced, their crimes exposed, and their reputations obliterated. For a society that tied a family's honor to the chastity of its women, this dishonor carried as much weight as death itself in Greece. The concept of communal justice often turned execution into collective humiliation. Records suggest that women who betrayed their cities or violated sacred laws could be tied, exposed, and displayed before execution. In some regions, women were forced to endure ritualistic stripping of their clothes, leaving them defenseless before their peers and enemies alike. For ancient societies where modesty was tied to virtue, this exposure was not just a physical violation, but a symbolic annihilation. The connection between religious law and punishment further intensified the humiliation in both cultures. When women were accused of impiety offenses against the gods, their punishments were often designed to reflect their supposed moral corruption. For example, in Rome, women accused of witchcraft, sorcery, or poisoning were sometimes executed in public, their deaths framed as purifications for society. The spectacle reinforced the idea that women's disobedience endangered not only themselves but the entire community. By humiliating and destroying them, the state reaffirmed its power and its connection to divine authority. The Colosseum and other arenas became the ultimate stage for such spectacles. Women condemned as criminals, slaves, or captives were sometimes forced to reenact mythical stories, playing the roles of disgraced heroines before being killed in orchestrated scenes. These were not simple executions, they were theatrical humiliations, transforming death into a twisted form of entertainment. The woman's suffering was no longer private, it was a show for thousands of onlookers. Their bodies became props in the empire's grand narrative of control and power. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of these executions is how silence often followed them. Women who endured such humiliations left no voices behind. Their stories were told by men historians, poets, officials who used their deaths to moralize, to warn, or to entertain. What survives are not the perspectives of the condemned, but the narratives of those who justified or consumed their suffering. And yet, through the fragments of history, the cruelty is undeniable. These humiliating executions reveal not just the harshness of ancient justice, but also the imbalance of power that defined these societies. A man might face death for treason or rebellion, but he could often die with honor. A woman, however, was rarely afforded such dignity. Her death was transformed into an act of dishonor. Her body and reputation used as tools to reinforce the authority of the state and the expectations of society. The lessons of these brutal stories are clear. The ancient world wielded shame as a weapon, especially against women. Execution was not simply about punishment. It was about control, about sending a message to every household, every daughter, every wife, that their place was fragile and their obedience demanded. For Rome and Greece, humiliation was as powerful as the sword and in many ways more lasting. Today, when we look back on these practices, we see not just history, but the reflection of how societies have long used gender and honor as tools of power. The suffering of these women, whether Vestal Virgins buried alive, Greek women stoned before their communities, or captives thrown naked to beasts in the arena, stands as a grim reminder of how justice was twisted into cruelty. Their deaths were not simply about ending lives, but about destroying dignity, ensuring their shame would live on as both warning and spectacle. And so, the most humiliating executions of women in ancient Greece and Rome expose the darkest truths of the ancient world, that control was maintained not only through violence, but through humiliation, and that the bodies of women were often the chosen battleground. If you found this exploration of ancient history shocking and thought-provoking, make sure to like this video, share it with others who love uncovering the dark truths of the past, and subscribe for more stories that reveal the hidden, brutal realities of history. From Rome's emperors to Greece's rituals, the ancient world is filled with stories that will both disturb and fascinate, and we'll continue to uncover them here